And next on our agenda is we're going to have a talk by Mike Sims, who Mike used to be, yes, Mike Sims. Mike left Pepperdine maybe a year and a half ago, and you can read in the little brochure his current endeavors. He's always stayed busy. But I want to just give a couple remarks about who Mike Sims is and how he was viewed by George Graziadio. Mike went to work at Imperial Bank, and we got to know Mike during that time period. And what I observed from George and talked to George, Mike became a very, very trusted friend to George Graziadio. I don't know if it had to do with the fact that Mike played a good game of golf. Might have had a little play there. But George really respected Mike. And he respected Mike, and one of the things he used to talk about and tell me was that he would say a couple times, do you know Mike was served in Vietnam in the infantry, in the Army? Because he was always very impressed that Mike served his country and during a very tough time. But Mike was such a good friend that he, I don't know quite the story, Mike will probably tell us how he became to join Pepperdine. And at Pepperdine, Mike became extremely innovative with programs starting the Friends of George golf tournament. He even initiated this luncheon, the George Awards luncheon, was his idea for the Board of Visitors to sponsor. There were numerous ideas that Mike came up with, but not just coming up with ideas, he was a worker, implementer, and did what it took to make things happen. So it's a great pleasure and a great honor for me personally to welcome Mike to his own program, the George Awards, to talk about George.
I never thought I would do this. Thank you, Steve. It's always fun to come to this. I remember with Linda Livingstone, who was the dean at the time, sat down and we said, you know, we really don't recognize our outstanding people. And this was, I guess, 8 years ago. And I told her, you know, if George were here, he'd be very upset with that because he was very set on recognizing people who did really good work. We did it at the bank, and it was part of his TNT philosophy, which I'm sure most of you have heard over the years, today, not tomorrow. And when somebody did something really well, he would pat you on the back and say, great job, and, you know, and raise a lot of fuss over you, and turn around and kind of, oh, what are you doing next? Right? He was pushing all the time. Anyway, it was great fun. You mentioned Vietnam. I'm going back to Vietnam for the first time in 50 years in December, so I'm kind of anxious about that. But I have been meeting with some students in the program that are veterans, and a great bunch of folks. And I was just talking to Jen O, who's a former Air Force major, just got a great summer gig with Southwest, and it was congratulations to Kyle. It's always nice to see a vet do something, so congratulations to both of you. I did actually, I know Dave wanted me to know about this opportunity 2 or 3 months ago, but I think it was too much, so he waited until 2 days ago to call me. Anyway, it's, I know we were expecting Mary Adams, and Mary was George's executive assistant for how many years, Aaliyah? 30? I don't know, a long time. She has much better stories than I do, so you have to come back next year and hear her when she's back next year. And I was sitting here listening to Whitney in her presentation. I should have talked to you beforehand and had you write this for me, because you're very good. Could have used your help. And I did also want to say thanks to one guy in particular who we went to when we started this 8 years ago and said, gee, would you help us out financially? And he's done it every year since, and that's Mark Miller, and he's a great guy, and we appreciate that very much. And another stalwart is Danny's son, and Danny isn't here, I guess, but she's been a great supporter of this program since the early days. I wish I could say hi to her, but please pass on my regards to her. George wrote a big check in 1996, and at the time, it was the largest donation ever given to a business school in the United States. The initial check, I think, was $15 million, and then there was another $5 million on top of that, so it came to about $20 million. Today, you probably add another zero to that, right? But at the time, it was a huge deal, and he was on the board of Anderson School's Board of Visitors, and he came to my office. My office is right down the hall from his, and he said, you know, I just decided to write this check to Pepperdine, and they're going to name the school after me, and I've been serving on this Anderson School board at UCLA, their Board of Visitors, and there are 20 people on that board, and it bewildered him. And he said, Mike, bring your Rolodex, and went into his office, and he said, I want 100 people on my Board of Visitors at the Graziadio School. And I said, really? And what are you going to do with 100 people, you know, once a month or once a quarter? And he said, no, they'll all come. And sure enough, we went through his Rolodex and a couple others, and everybody he invited to come on the Board of Visitors joined. Everybody. Nobody said no. And I think the reason for that is that George was, when you needed something, George was always there. It was part of the banker thinking in making loans and helping businesses grow. But more so and he got further into his career, he loved to play golf, as Steve mentioned. And if somebody was sponsoring a golf tournament and honoring an executive, George would always write a $25,000 check and help sponsor that tournament, raise money for the charity that was involved, and help honor one of his business friends. And what happened is when George got honored, they would write a $25,000 check to his charity. In those days, it was the Hobie Foundation, the Hugh O'Brien Youth Foundation we did a lot of work with. And he had this network of execs in LA that they were all very, there was a certain camaraderie amongst them that you would never guess because of who they are and who they were. And some had great publicity, some, like Angelo, didn't have such great publicity. But they were very close and supported each other, and George was a very, very strong supporter of a lot of charities. You look at his bio, I'm not going to do his bio today, but you look at his bio, and he supported dozens and dozens of charities. And he was recognized by dozens and dozens of organizations all over the country, and Italy also. But he was remarkable that way. But what he loved most, I think, was the school. And he used to call it his school, right? I guess you write that big a check, you can call it anything you want, but it was his school. George never went to college, as some of you probably know, and he was always impressed with the faculty and what was going on at the school. And I remember, I don't see, Andy's not here, is he? No, okay, I can tell this story. He's not here. I remember George had some favorite words. You know, he was always perpetually dissatisfied. You know, that's how he was so successful, I think. And he was always dismayed about certain things. There were certain key words that you knew he used all the time. And I remember he sent a note to Andy when they were building the Graziadio campus up at the top of Malibu, and the letter said something to the effect to Andy. He said, do you know it took 28 months to build the Taj Mahal? Do you know that we won World War II in 4 years? And you're telling me it's going to take 6 years to build that building? You know, he was dismayed. I think it was called the Coastal Commission, wasn't it, or something like that? Yeah. And he wanted to see it built before he passed, and he didn't quite make it. But he was always pushing. And I first met him. I used to work in Beverly Hills, and they had the regional office for Imperial Bank was there, and I got a call one day from them, and they asked me to put together a marketing plan. They were in Beverly Hills in the 80s. There were 54 banks in Beverly Hills. There are probably 10 or 15 today, I would guess, maybe. And Imperial Bank ranked 49th or 50th in deposits of those 54, 55 banks. That dismayed George also. And they asked me to put together a marketing plan to build deposits, and I did, and they liked it, and he liked it in particular, and he asked me to come to work, and that's how I went to work for him, was to implement that particular marketing plan. And at about between 12 and 18 months, we'd moved into the top 20 of the 55, 54 banks, and he was very excited, so he invited me to come down to headquarters at LAX and become the chief marketing officer for the bank. And I remember I was very intimidated because I didn't know anything about banking, and I'd only been there a year and a half, and all of a sudden I was running in circles I shouldn't have been running in. And I was sitting in my office one night, and I was right down the hall from him, as I said, and it was probably 7 o'clock, and I think I was the only one in the building, but I was just cramming, trying to learn everything I could about banking. And there was a knock on my door, and George stuck his head in. In one hand he had a bottle of wine, in the other hand he had 2 glasses. And he said, "Mike, do you drink wine?" And I said, "Yes, I do, now." And I learned to drink wine because of him. And he said, "Do you mind if I come in and we'll have a glass of wine?" And then I think that's what started that relationship Steve was referring to. We would sit at 7 or 8 o'clock at night and we talk a little bit about the bank, not too much, but mostly about golf, and we talk about families, and we talk about travel. And George was a huge traveler, right? He loved to go around the world. And we talked about garlic and some of his other favorite things. And we did that probably I don't know, 3 or 4 times a year maybe. It wasn't very often, but it was always a thrill to have him knock on your door and stand there with a bottle of great Italian wine and sit down and, just talk like a couple buddies, right? It was pretty remarkable. I'm trying to look here. I want to keep us on time here. The other thing, the TNT thing, I have to do this. I'm sorry. I apologize to you guys for this. The faculty I'm looking at over here. The TNT thing was, it wasn't created by an ad agency. It was just George. George was his own ad agency. He had a brilliant mind. When he opened banks in the old days, he was the first guy to put a helicopter over a bank branch when it was opening and throw money out. He threw turkeys out of helicopters, and he had most of you are too young to remember the days when they had pole sitters, if you know what a pole sitter is, right? And he hired a pole sitter to open up a bank branch, and the deal was to the press that he had to sit up there he had a little perch on this pole, and the pole was 25, 30 feet high, and they had a little wood shack up there. And this poor guy had to sit up there for 4 days or until they opened 1,000 accounts or something, right? And he's literally up there 24/7, and they used a bucket to do things with and ship it. But one of the tellers was a young woman had just gotten out of college, and it was her first job, and her job was to send him food up, fill the bucket, and then he'd pull the food up and the water and whatnot. And about the third day, and he had KNX TV, Channel 2 out there one day, and they put him up on a crane, and the reporter and he were on the crane, and they were interviewing this guy in the house on top of the pole. And he came back the next day, and it was the third day, and the guy was gone. And he was dismayed again. And he went into the branch, and he, in colorful language, asked where the pole sitter went. And they said, they don't know, but the teller's gone also. She'd fallen in love with the pole sitter, and she was gone. George gave, and in those days, when he first started the bank, this is back in the early 60s, he started the bank, when you signed up at Imperial Bank, you got free checking for life. And George is one of the first bankers in the country to do this. It was very innovative, right? Free checking for life. 30 years later, I would sit down with him over wine, and he said, that was the dumbest thing I ever did, because I've still got 27,000 free checking accounts, 30 some years later, and I'm losing money on every one of them. But it was a great deal at the time, and helped build the bank. And there were 2 phone calls I got from him that I remember most. One was, he said, Mike, I need you to go up to San Jose. It was called San Jose then, it wasn't called Silicon Valley. And we just loaned $2 million to a company named Yahoo. And he says, I don't know what the hell a Yahoo is. Would you please go up and find out why we gave him $2 million? And I went up there, and I was, of course, dressed like a banker with a three-piece suit on and a briefcase. And I remember standing at their front door, and it was a small office, narrow, long, one wall of computers, and then a wall of desks. And everybody was in tank tops and flip-flops and shorts. And I'm standing there trying to figure out, we loaned you $2 million? The bankers probably appreciate this. And they became the first client we had of about 450 in Silicon Valley. We soon opened up a branch across the street from Stanford on Sand Hill Road. And it was my favorite office because it had a pool table in the middle of the office, and that's where all the deals were done in those days. But George was very, very smart about getting into Silicon Valley early. And we made some amazing, amazing deals in those days. And like I say, long before Silicon Valley was Silicon Valley. And great, tremendous wealth into the bank. The other phone call I got, I'm not going to mention a name on this one, I'll let you all guess, but I got a phone call and it said, Mike, I'm going to kick all of the entertainment business managers out of the bank, out of our Beverly Hills office. And 2 blocks down the street was City National Bank, which had a big entertainment business, right? A big entertainment business. We were the 2 entertainment banks in town. And I said, you're doing what? And he said, I want you to contact them all and get them out of the bank. I don't want them here anymore. And I said, George, that's a lot of money. We worked really hard to build these deposits up, and it's millions of dollars. And I said, what's the problem? And he said, well, there was this actor who had a huge movie and went to Wichita, Kansas to buy a private jet. And he wrote a $10 million check on his personal checking account, and it bounced. But the guy just had a $100 million film, and just reached in his wallet and gave I don't know which airline, Beach or whoever, Beechcraft or whatever it was, gave him $10 million, and it bounced. And George said, nobody bounces a $10 million check on my bank. And it cost us probably another $10 or $12 million, but we invited them all out. And the punchline is that 10 years later, that guy was the governor of California. Anyway, but I won't mention his name. I'm gonna cut short. George was known. You see a lot of his photos. You see him, and particularly the statue right up at the campus. His arms are always out, and that's the way he walked into rooms. He was, and he'd say, "Graziadio's here," right? And he'd walk into a room, and people loved it. And I always thought it was his personality, just his innate ability. He loved people. He loved to talk, and reading some history about him years ago. He was he tried to enlist in the Army Air Corps in World War II, and he got rejected because he had a depth perception problem, and he ended up going to work in the aircraft business here. And then I realized, well, maybe that's why he always has those pictures of him with his hands out, because he's afraid he's going to run into somebody and not know. Maybe not. I don't know. Could be the Italian. Yes, yeah. So I'm just going to close. He has so many quotes, and I have a sheet at home, a list of all of his quotes, his TNT type quotes, and I think everybody's heard most of those, or they've seen them in print. I think they're on print on a lot of these photos. So I started looking for things that George might have said. Okay, and I found some really interesting ones, and I said, yeah, that pretty much sounds like him. So I'm just going to end it with a few quotes. Money will buy a fine dog, but only kindness will make him wag his tail. That sounded like George to me. If you don't have a sense of humor, you probably don't have any sense at all. That sounded like him to me also. This next one I know sounded like him. He could have said this one. Business conventions. This fits for faculty conventions also. Business conventions are important because they demonstrate how many people a company can do without. Try and ask George to pay for a convention. It was really hard to do. And as a banker, he would have said, be careful about reading the fine print. There's no way you're going to like it. And the last one I had was two more. Life is tied with a bow. Life isn't tied with a bow, but it's still a gift. And I think he looked at life that way. It was hard. You had to work your fanny off. No excuses, but it was well worth it. And the finest one, the last one, has a little bit to do with his TNT quote. The nicest thing about the future is it always starts tomorrow. And that was his whole thing with TNT, I think. It was, let's just get it done. So I want to thank Dave for inviting me. I want to thank Early X Foundation for buying a table. And I want to thank the students. I wish you all really well. When I got this award a few years ago, I left saying, be bold, all of you students. You're not going to succeed in this world unless you're bold. And George was, if anything, he was a bold man with a vision and a tenacity to make things happen as nobody I have ever known. And I think if we can all figure out how we can be bold and move at a pace and challenge ourselves, you have a great education, you have a great network of alumni, you have great faculty to call on, the administration, everybody here to support you. And I think it's your challenge now to leverage everything that you've learned and go out and get them. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.